A black lawyer walked into the courthouse, ready to argue the biggest case of his career. But within minutes, everything changed. A judge, known for his bias, dismissed him without cause, humiliating him in front of a packed courtroom. Then, just 10 minutes later, the entire legal system was shaken by what happened next. What unfolded in that courtroom set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that need to be told. It started as just another day in court, but it didn't stay that way for long. A man like Henry Ellis had learned, from an early age, that America was a place of contradictions. It could lift a man up with one hand and strike him down with the other. It could praise him for his talents while ensuring that those talents never reached their full potential. It could shake his hand in public and dismiss his worth in private. So when Henry, a man of quiet dignity and quiet success, stepped into the Magnolia Cafe, he already knew how the evening would unfold. The cafe was small, elegant in an understated way, with its polished wooden floors and white tablecloths. The kind of place that catered to people who did not have to check the price of a meal before ordering. The air carried the soft hum of conversation, the clinking of silverware against porcelain, the occasional burst of laughter that drifted like a melody in the background. Henry had been here before, many times. In fact, it was his wife's favorite place. And though she was no longer with him, he kept coming back, not out of habit, but out of something deeper. A need to remember. He walked in, dressed in the sort of suit that spoke of quiet wealth, and nodded at the hostess. A thin, young woman with hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to shape the very expression on her face. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?" Henry smiled. "Yes, Ellis. 7 o'clock. She scanned the list in front of her. Lips pursed. A tiny flicker of hesitation in her expression. It was quick. So quick that a man who had not spent his life watching for such things might have missed it. But Henry had been watching all his life. The hesitation turned into a smile. Professional. Distant. "Of course. Right this way." She led him past tables filled with well-dressed patrons. Mostly white, their eyes flickering toward him in that subtle, assessing way. The glance that asked a question but never spoke it aloud. Who is he? Why is he here? He followed the hostess toward the back, past the warm glow of candlelight and the laughter of well-fed men, until she stopped at a small, dimly lit table near the kitchen. "This is the best we have available tonight," she said. The words were polite, but the meaning was clear. Henry looked at the table. He looked at the other tables. The ones by the windows, bathed in the soft light of the chandeliers. He looked back at her. "Are you sure?" His voice was even, measured. Her smile faltered. "I'm afraid we're quite full." Henry had a choice to make. He could sit. He could accept the unspoken message that he had been given his place. And that place was not among the others. Or he could remind them all that a man like him did not ask for permission to belong. He adjusted his cufflinks, smiled slightly, and said, "I think I'll wait for something better." The hostess hesitated, and in that hesitation, Henry saw it. The moment where civility clashed with something deeper. Something that had been taught, ingrained, passed down through generations. But she nodded. "Of course. If you'd like to wait at the bar, we'll call you when a table opens." And so Henry Ellis took a seat at the bar, ordered a bourbon neat, and waited. Waited to see just how far the thin veil of civility would stretch before it finally tore. Henry Ellis sat at the bar, his bourbon neat, the glass heavy in his hand. He took a slow sip, let the burn settle in his chest, and listened. The Magnolia Cafe had its own rhythm, its own unspoken rules. The laughter swelled and softened at just the right moments. The clinking of glasses punctuated conversations full of half-truths and polished pleasantries. It was the kind of place where people knew how to play the game. Where power moved in whispers. Where wealth carried an unshakable confidence. And where a man like Henry was, at best, an anomaly, at worst, an intrusion. The bartender, a lean man with a careful smile, approached. "Another round, sir?" Henry set his glass down. Not just yet. The bartender hesitated, glanced toward the hostess stand where the young woman from earlier was speaking in hushed tones to a tall man in a dark suit. The manager. Most likely. Henry recognized the posture, the way the man's gaze flicked toward him before returning to the hostess. A quiet decision was being made. Henry exhaled slowly, watching the game unfold. He had seen it before. He had lived it before. He had been a boy standing outside department store windows, knowing which doors he could enter and which ones he could not. He had been a young man in boardrooms where his presence was tolerated but never embraced. He had learned, long ago, that America would let you climb just high enough to believe in the illusion. Just before reminding you that you would never truly be part of the structure itself. The manager approached. Mr. Ellis, I presume? His voice was smooth, the kind of voice that had talked its way out of difficult conversations before. Henry turned slightly on his stool. That's right. The manager smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. I understand there was some confusion about your seating. I do apologize. Unfortunately, we are fully booked tonight, and there are no other tables available. Henry let the words settle between them. Let the weight of their meaning take shape. No tables available. Not for him. He could have pressed the issue. Could have demanded an explanation. But that would have given the man what he wanted. A reason to dismiss him entirely. A reason to make him the problem. So instead, Henry smiled. That's strange, he said lightly, tilting his head just enough to glance toward the dining area. I see at least 2 open tables by the window. Unless, of course, you're expecting guests to fill them in the next few minutes? The manager's smile faltered. There are reservations. Quote. Henry nodded, slow and deliberate. Of course. He turned back to the bartender. Then I'll finish my drink. The manager hesitated. He had expected compliance. He had expected Henry to lower his gaze, to make it easier for him to move along to the next guest. The next exchange of pleasantries. But Henry had simply chosen to exist in a space where he was not wanted. And that was a problem. Sir, the manager said, voice still polite but firmer now. We do have a policy regarding time spent at the bar. Henry chuckled softly. I see. And does this policy apply to everyone? The manager's lips parted slightly. But no words came. There it was again. The hesitation. The same moment he had seen in the hostess's face. The thin, fragile line between civility and something else entirely. Henry could feel it. The weight of the room shifting. Other patrons had begun to notice, though most pretended not to. A man at the far end of the bar stole a glance. Then returned to his conversation. A woman, elegantly dressed, frowned slightly before whispering something to her companion. They all know. The bartender cleared his throat. Would you like to order something else? Sir? His voice was measured, careful, a lifeline, perhaps. Henry considered it. He could let it go. He could finish his drink. Leave quietly. Pretend that nothing had happened. That was the rule, wasn't it? That was how the game was played. But then he thought of his wife. Sitting at this very bar years ago. Laughing over a glass of wine. He thought of his father, who had never been allowed to sit at bars like these. He thought of the countless moments when he had swallowed the indignities of a world that had never truly made room for him. No, not tonight. Henry turned back to the manager, met his gaze fully, and smiled. I think I will have another round. The bartender hesitated for only a moment before pouring the bourbon. The manager's jaw tightened, but he nodded once and stepped away. And Henry sat there, drink in hand, knowing that he had not won the game. But he had refused to lose. Henry Ellis knew that America did not like to be confronted with itself. It preferred its illusions, its comfortable lies wrapped in the language of progress. It preferred its stories about how far it had come, how much had changed, how color no longer mattered, so long as one played by the rules. But Henry had learned, long ago, that the rules were never meant to serve men like him. They were designed to keep him in his place, to ensure that even when he played the game perfectly, he would still find himself standing on the outside looking in. And tonight, he found himself looking in from the edge of a dining room that had no place for him. The Magnolia Cafe's main dining hall was a picture of elegance. white linen tablecloths stretching across mahogany tables, wine glasses reflecting the golden light of chandeliers. The scent of butter and rosemary filled the air, carried by the soft hum of conversation. This was the kind of place where deals were made in hushed tones over steak and cognac. Where men who had never been denied a seat at the table sat comfortably, unaware of the weight of their own privilege. And in the center of it all, seated at the table Henry had originally reserved, was a man he had met before. Charles Whitmore. The name alone carried weight in this town. Whitmore owned half the office buildings in the financial district, had a direct line to every mayor for the last 20 years, and carried himself like a man who had never heard the word not spoken with any real conviction. Henry had once shaken the man's hand at a business luncheon, watched him give speeches about the virtues of hard work and determination. But tonight, Whitmore was laughing over a bottle of wine, seated at the very table that had been unavailable just minutes before. Henry had seen this play before. He could hear the echoes of his father's voice. A man who had fought his whole life for a place that never quite let him in. They don't have to say it, son. They show it. Henry didn't need anyone to say it tonight. He could see it in the way the manager avoided his eyes, in the way the waiter hovered near Whitmore's table, attentive, anticipating his every need, in the way the Magnolia Cafe had made a choice. And yet, something in him refused to turn away. Instead, Henry did what he had not done in years. He crossed the room. The murmur of conversation did not stop. But he felt the shift. The way eyes flickered toward him. The way backs straightened ever so slightly, as though bracing for something unpleasant. Whitmore, mid-sip, looked up, his smile faltering for just a fraction of a second before he recovered. Alice, what a surprise. Henry nodded. Whitmore. A pause. The air between them thickened. Henry's eyes flicked to the empty chair across from Whitmore. A chair that should have been his. Whitmore followed his gaze and chuckled. Small world. I didn't realize you dined here. Henry tilted his head slightly, allowing the silence to stretch long enough to make Whitmore uncomfortable. Neither did I. The waiter, sensing something unspoken, cleared his throat. Can I bring you a drink, sir? Henry turned, meeting the young man's gaze. The waiter, a nervous-looking kid no older than 25, shifted from foot to foot, clearly unsure of what to do. Henry smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I already have one at the bar. Whitmore leaned back, swirling his wine in his glass. You should join us. No reason to sit alone. An invitation, but not really. It was a test, a trap disguised as generosity. A way to pretend there was no problem at all, so long as Henry played his role. Henry exhaled slowly. He could say no. He could walk away. Let them have their game. Let them keep their illusions intact. Or, he could sit. So he pulled the chair out, slow and deliberate, and sat down across from Whitmore. The silence that followed was a thing of its own. Whitmore lifted his glass. Good company. Henry did not lift him. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, his fingers tracing the edges of the linen. Tell me something, Whitmore, he said, his voice smooth, even. How did you get this table? The question landed like a stone in a still pond. Whitmore blinked, his smile still fixed but growing thinner by the second. What do you mean? Henry gestured slightly with his hand. I had a reservation for this table 30 minutes ago. I was told there were no available seats. But here you are. Whitmore's smile faltered for real this time. He glanced toward the manager, who had conveniently disappeared. Well, I suppose there was a mix-up. Henry nodded. A mix-up. Neither of them spoke. The waiter, still standing awkwardly beside them, cleared his throat. Would you like to see the menu, sir? Henry exhaled through his nose. No, he said, rising from his chair. I think I've already seen everything I need to. Whitmore watched him stand, a flicker of something, perhaps shame, perhaps discomfort, passing over his features, but Henry knew better than to mistake it for regret. Whitmore would sleep well tonight. He would finish his steak and his wine. And by morning, he would have convinced himself that nothing had happened at all. Henry walked back toward the bar. His steps measured, his heart steady. He had not won the game. But tonight, he had forced them to look at it. And sometimes, that was enough. For now, there was something about old debts in America. Not the kind that banks chased after. Not the kind written on crisp sheets of paper with neat signatures. No, this was something older, something deeper, a debt that never quite seemed to get paid. No matter how many years passed. No matter how many laws changed. And Henry Ellis knew, as he walked down 125th Street that evening, that he was about to be reminded of it once again. The city had cooled slightly since the day's unbearable heat, but the streets still hummed with the kind of energy that only Harlem could carry. The old men gathered outside the barber shops, exchanging war stories about women and money they no longer had. The children weaved between cars, chasing a ball that had lost its color. The shopkeepers stood in their doorways, their eyes tracking every passerby with the quiet calculation of men who had learned to expect the worst. It had been years since Henry had truly walked these streets. He was not a stranger here. Not exactly, but the world had a way of making a man feel like an outsider. Even in the place that had raised him. And tonight, he felt it more than ever. At the corner of Lenox Avenue, just beneath the flickering glow of a failing street lamp, stood Louis Davenport. Louis was the kind of man who carried history in his bones. His face, carved by time and hardship, spoke of a man who had learned the hard way that survival was its own kind of war. The last time Henry had seen him, they had been teenagers, standing outside Mr. Robinson's grocery store, flipping quarters and dreaming about a world they had yet to meet. But the world had a funny way of meeting you first. Henry had gone on to law school, to offices filled with men who barely looked at him when they spoke. Louis had gone to prison. And yet, here they were again. Louis looked up as Henry approached, his expression unreadable. Didn't think I'd ever see you out here again. Henry nodded. Didn't think I'd be back. A long silence stretched between them. Louis took a slow drag of his cigarette. They still treating you like a guest at the table? Henry exhaled through his nose. They always do. Louis chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Yeah, I figured. Another silence. Henry glanced at the shop behind them. Davenport's Hardware. The name painted in faded gold letters across the glass. It had been Louis's father's shop once. The kind of place that had survived longer than it had any right to. You still running the place? Henry asked. Louis flicked his cigarette onto the pavement, crushing it beneath his heel. Trying to. Henry caught the hesitation in his voice. Something wrong? Louis scoffed. Everything's wrong. He gestured toward the window. They raised the rent again. Another $600 a month. Henry frowned. That can't be legal. Legal doesn't mean a damn thing. Louis muttered. They have a dozen ways to push folks out. And they don't have to break a single law to do it. Henry knew it was true. He had seen it before. In meetings where men in suits spoke in polite, measured tones about redevelopment and urban renewal. About opportunities that never seemed to reach the people who had built the neighborhood in the first place. How long have you got? Henry asked. Louis shrugged. Maybe a month. Maybe 2. Henry stared at the faded paint on the shop's sign. At the glass that had been cleaned 1,000 times but still carried the weight of years. This place belonged to your father, Henry said. Louis nodded. And his father before him. He sighed. But that doesn't mean anything to these people. Henry looked at him. It should. Louis chuckled again, shaking his head. You still think the world works like that? Henry didn't answer. Because the truth was, he didn't know anymore. The next morning, Henry found himself standing in front of a desk that had once felt like a victory. His name was carved into the wood in a way that suggested permanence. But he knew better. His office, though large, was still a borrowed space. A room that had been given to him with the understanding that it could just as easily be taken away. He had spent the night sifting through legal codes, looking for something, anything, that could keep Louis in that store. He had found what he had expected. Loopholes. Fine print. Technicalities designed to work against men like Louis. Against men like himself. And yet, something in him refused to let it go. He picked up the phone and dialed. Whitmore Realty. A voice on the other end answered. Henry kept his voice level. I need to speak with Charles Whitmore. A pause. Then, one moment, please. The line clicked. Then, Whitmore's voice, smooth and casual. Ellis, to what do I owe the pleasure? Henry didn't waste time. The rent increased on Davenport's hardware. Roll it back. A chuckle. Now, Henry, you know that's not how this works. It's extortion, Charles. It's business. Henry clenched his jaw. He's been there for 30 years. Whitmore sighed. And for 30 years, he's been sitting on prime real estate. You know how this game is played. Henry knew. But knowing and accepting were two different things. What do you want? Henry asked, his voice cold. Whitmore was silent for a moment. Then, he spoke, slow and deliberate. I have a client, he said. A lawsuit that's getting messy. He needs representation. You handle it, and maybe I reconsider the rent. Henry felt something hot coil in his chest. You want me to clean up your mess in exchange for keeping a man in his home? Not his home, Henry. His business. Henry closed his eyes. And there it was. The debt. The one America never quite paid. Because even now, even with all his degrees and all his success, Henry was still being asked to earn what men like Whitmore were given without question. A seat at the table. But never truly at the table. He could walk away. Or he could play the game. For Lewis. For something bigger than his pride. Henry exhaled. Send me the case file, he said. And just like that, the game continued. Henry Ellis had made a deal with the devil. Or at least, with a man who wore the devil's smile. Dressed in a suit tailored to fit a body that had never known hunger. Never known fear. Charles Whitmore was the kind of man who spoke softly but carried the weight of a world that bent in his favor. He didn't raise his voice because he had never needed to. And now, Henry had agreed to play his game. The case file arrived that afternoon. A thick manila folder that landed on his desk with a quiet but unmistakable thud. Henry stared at it for a long time before he opened it. Inside, there were names he recognized. Names that had appeared in newspapers. Names whispered in courtrooms. Names belonging to men who had always known how to slip through the cracks of justice. A real estate tycoon accused of fraud. Millions of dollars shuffled between accounts. Disappearing into the folds of a system designed to hide wealth from those who needed it most. Henry had spent his career trying to bring men like this to justice. Now, he was being asked to save one. His stomach turned as he flipped through the pages. Because this was how the world worked. Wasn't it? A black man wanted to keep his store. His father's store. His grandfather's store. And in order to do that, another black man had to get his hands dirty. And had to make himself useful to the men who controlled the rules of the game. Henry closed the file. He pressed his fingers to his temples and exhaled. Then, he picked up the phone. The next day, Henry walked into a building that smelled like polished wood and expensive silence. The kind of place where men spoke in half-truths over glasses of bourbon. Where backroom deals were made in rooms without windows. Whitmore was waiting. Ellis, he said, smiling like he had already won. I knew you'd come around. Henry didn't smile back. He sat down, set the file on the table between them. This man is guilty, he said flatly. Whitmore chuckled. Of course he is. That's why he needs you. Henry's hands curled into fists beneath the table. You want me to save him? Henry said, voice low. I want you to do your job. Whitmore corrected. And in return, Davenport's hardware stays open. Everybody wins. Henry exhaled sharply through his nose. Everybody? Whitmore's smile flickered. Just for a second. The people who matter. Henry felt something twist in his gut. Because that was the game. The people who mattered. The people who didn't. Men like Whitmore didn't care about laws or justice. They only cared about leverage. And Henry knew, deep down, that even this deal, this ugly, lopsided exchange, was its own kind of privilege. Because there were men who wouldn't have even been given the choice. There were men who would have been told to leave. Or worse. And that was the thing about America. Wasn't it? It never had to tell you outright who you were. It just made sure you always knew. 3 days later, Henry sat across from Lewis in the back of the hardware store. The air thick with sawdust and quiet resentment. You did what? Lewis asked, his voice sharp. Henry's jaw tightened. I cut a deal. Lewis shook his head. A slow, disbelieving motion. You cut a deal with them? They weren't going to back down. Henry said. You weren't going to win. So you decided to win for me? Lewis's voice was cold now. Henry didn't answer. Because he didn't have an answer. Lewis leaned back, arms crossed over his chest. And what did you have to do for it? Henry hesitated. Because the truth felt heavier than the lie. Finally, he said, I had to make sure the right man stayed out of prison. Lewis let out a dry, humorless laugh. The right man? Henry looked away. You think this makes you better than them? Lewis asked. Because you play the game with cleaner hands? Henry's throat tightened. Because he didn't know. Because maybe, just maybe, Lewis was right. Maybe there was no such thing as clean hands in a world that had been built on dirty deals. Maybe the real crime wasn't breaking the rules. Maybe it was believing, even for a second, that the rules had ever been made for men like them. That night, Henry sat alone in his office. The weight of his choices pressing down on his chest like a stone. Outside, the city moved without him. The neon lights flickered, the taxis rumbled past. Somewhere, someone was laughing. And Henry, in his quiet, borrowed corner of the world, stared at his own reflection in the window, wondering which side of the debt he stood on now. The thing about power was that it never needed to introduce itself. It was always there, sitting at the head of the table, speaking in measured tones, smiling in ways that never quite reached the eyes. Henry Ellis understood that now. He understood it when he walked into the courthouse that morning, his briefcase heavy in his hand, his stomach twisted into knots he would never let show on his face. He had done what was asked of him. He had defended a man who did not deserve defending. He had spoken in polished sentences. Had framed the truth so carefully that it no longer looked like itself. And in return, the store had been saved. Davenport's Hardware still stood on the corner of 145th and Lenox. Its windows shining under the New York sun. Lewis still stood behind the counter, still counting change in calloused hands. But the price had been paid. And Henry was the one who had paid for it. The courtroom was full that day. Not with reporters, not with cameras, because stories like these never made the front page. But with men in suits who sat with easy confidence. And men in uniforms who stood at the doors like statues, their hands resting near their belts. The case had been decided before it even began. Henry had only been there to play his part. And he had played it well. Now, as he walked toward the exit, Charles Whitmore stood waiting, his suit crisp, his smile polished. Good work, Ellis, he said. Henry didn't respond. You see? Whitmore continued. You're useful. You're valuable. I knew you would be. Henry felt something cold settle in his chest. Because that was what men like Whitmore did. Wasn't it? They made you believe you had a choice. When really, they had only ever given you the illusion of one. Henry had thought that if he played the game, if he moved carefully enough, he could come out the other side intact. But now, standing in front of Whitmore, he understood the truth. He was already in too deep. And the only way out was to keep going further in. That night, Henry sat alone in his apartment. The city moving outside his window, alive with lights and laughter and the hum of taxi engines. His father had once told him that America had two sets of rules. One for them, and one for everyone else. Henry had spent his whole life trying to pretend that wasn't true. But today, in that courtroom, he had seen it written in the space between the judge's words. In the way the jury never really looked at the man in the defendant's chair. In the way the police officer standing in the back had already known how the verdict would fall before the gavel even hit the desk. The rules had never changed. Only the players did. The next morning, Henry went to see Lewis. The store smelled like sawdust and oil. Like it always had. The bell above the door rang as Henry stepped inside. The sound strangely comforting. Lewis looked up from the counter. You did it, he said flatly. Henry exhaled. Yeah. Lewis didn't smile. And what did it cost you? Henry ran a hand over his face. I don't know yet. Lewis nodded, like he had already known that answer. You think they'll let you walk away now? Henry didn't respond, because he knew the answer to that, too. Lewis sighed, shaking his head. You can't play their game. Henry, you can't win that way. Henry let out a hollow laugh. Then tell me how I'm supposed to win. Louis, tell me what I should have done. Louis leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. You should have let them burn it down. Henry felt something twist inside him. Let it burn? He repeated. Louis nodded. Yeah, let it burn. Because once you start making deals with men like that, you don't own anything anymore. Not your store, not your name, not yourself. Henry looked away, because he didn't know if he had anything left to own. That night, Henry sat in his car outside Whitmore's office, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. He had spent his whole life trying to climb, trying to prove that he was more than what the world saw when it looked at him. But now, he was starting to wonder if he had only been climbing in circles. Because no matter how high he got, the ground never stopped moving beneath his feet. And the men at the top were always waiting, smiling, reminding him who really made the rules. Henry closed his eyes. Then, he stepped out of the car and walked inside. Henry had learned, long before he ever stepped into a courtroom, that silence was a form of currency. It could be traded, bartered, spent in moments when words would cost too much. But silence was also a debt. And sooner or later, someone always came to collect. He sat across from Charles Whitmore, the office quiet except for the low hum of the city outside the tall glass windows. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, hands folded neatly in front of him. You understand now, don't you? Henry didn't respond. You see, Ellis, Whitmore continued, men like you, bright, ambitious, respectable, you're useful, but only if you learn to play by the rules. Henry's fingers curled into his palms. Whitmore tilted his head slightly. Tell me, how do you think this story ends? Henry exhaled slowly, forcing his expression to remain neutral. That depends. Do I get to write it? Whitmore laughed. You can write whatever you want. But the ink isn't yours. Henry's stomach twisted. You did the right thing in court. Whitmore continued. But don't mistake that for power. Power is knowing which battles to fight, which truths to tell, which stories to let die before they ever reach the light. Henry knew what this was. A warning, a reminder. The trial had been won. But he had lost something far greater. And Whitmore wanted to make sure he never forgot it. That night, Henry walked home through Harlem, his thoughts heavy, his feet moving as if on autopilot. The city was alive around him. Jazz spilled from open windows. Cars honked impatiently at street corners. Men in worn suits gathered beneath street lamps, arguing about tomorrow's headlines, about politics, about a world that never seemed to change. Henry barely heard any of it. He kept thinking about what Louis had said. You should have let it burn. Henry had spent his entire life building something, clawing his way into rooms he had never been invited into, learning how to speak in measured tones, how to fold his anger into crisp white collars and three-piece suits. But now, he wasn't sure if he had built anything at all, or if he had only been fortifying the walls of a prison. The next morning, Henry sat at his desk, the verdict still fresh in the newspapers. The front page carried the usual headlines. Businessman acquitted in landmark case. A victory for fair justice. Henry Ellis, the man behind the defense. He read each one carefully, then folded the paper neatly and set it aside. A knock at the door. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. Come in, he said. Louis stepped inside, his face unreadable. You got what you wanted, Louis said. Henry didn't answer. Louis pulled up a chair and sat down across from him, placing his hands on the desk. Tell me, Henry, when you look in the mirror, do you like what you see? Henry stared at him for a long time before responding. I don't know anymore. Louis nodded, as if he had expected that answer. You played their game, Louis said, and you won. But what did you really win? Henry clenched his jaw. I saved your store, Louis. No, Louis said, shaking his head. You saved a building, but you lost something bigger than that. And you know it. Henry leaned forward. Then tell me, Louis, what the hell was I supposed to do? Let them destroy everything? Louis met his eyes. Maybe, because sometimes, Henry, you have to let things fall apart so you can build something real. Henry exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. You think I don't know how this works? He said. You think I don't know what happens when you push too hard? Speak too loud? You end up dead, or worse, forgotten. Lewis studied him for a long moment. Maybe, Lewis said, or maybe you end up free. Henry's heart pounded. Because that was the thing. Wasn't it? He had spent his whole life chasing security. Chasing a seat at the table. Chasing the approval of men like Whitmore. And for what? For a name printed in a newspaper? For a verdict that was never in question? For a silence that he now realized was its own kind of prison? Henry looked at Lewis, his mind racing. You want me to burn it all down? Lewis shook his head. I want you to start telling the truth. Henry stared at him, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The truth. The truth was a dangerous thing. It didn't just set you free. It set everything around you on fire. And Henry wasn't sure if he was ready for that. But as he sat there, the weight of the past few weeks pressing against his chest, he realized something. The fire had already started. And whether he wanted to or not, he was standing in the middle of it. The thing about fire is that it does not ask for permission. It does not wait until the world is ready for it. It simply burns. Henry had spent his entire life trying to contain the flames. Trying to keep himself from becoming the kind of man the world feared. The kind of man they could not control. But something had changed. Something had cracked. And now, the fire was everywhere. The morning after his conversation with Lewis, Henry arrived at his office to find it different. It was still the same polished floor. The same heavy oak desk. The same bookshelf lined with cases that whispered of his success. But something had shifted. He saw it in the way people looked at him. In the way his secretary hesitated before saying good morning. In the way his phone, usually ringing off the hook, sat silent. Henry sat down, opened the newspaper, and stared at his own name in black ink. Attorney Ellis defends controversial verdict. I did what was necessary. He closed the paper, exhaling slowly. They had written his story for him. And now, there was only one way to take it back. By noon, the protests had begun. Outside his office window, people gathered, holding signs, chanting, demanding answers. They weren't here for justice. They were here for something deeper. For something that could not be written in legal briefs or debated in courtrooms. They were here for the truth. And the truth was, Henry had spent his whole life avoiding it. The knock at his door came sharp and sudden. Whitmore didn't wait for an answer. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. You're in a mess, he said, his voice smooth as ever. A real mess. Henry leaned back in his chair. Seems that way. Whitmore smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Don't worry, Ellis. We can fix this. But you need to keep your head down. Stay quiet. Let this blow over. Henry studied him. And if I don't? Whitmore's smile faded. Then I can't protect you. Henry laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. You never could. Whitmore's eyes darkened. Careful, Henry. You don't want to make an enemy of the people who built you. Henry's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. Built me? He repeated. Or used me? Whitmore sighed, shaking his head. This is exactly what I was afraid of. A little pressure and suddenly, you're ready to throw everything away. Henry stood up. No, he said. I'm finally ready to build something real. Whitmore stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. Well, he said, good luck with that. And then he was gone. Henry walked out of his office for the first time in hours. The protest had grown larger. The faces outside weren't just strangers anymore. He saw Lewis, standing at the front of the crowd. He saw Sarah, the young girl from the coffee shop. Her arms crossed, waiting to see what kind of man he was going to be. He saw people who looked like him. And people who didn't. But all of them were watching. Waiting. Expecting something. Henry stepped forward, feeling the weight of their eyes. He had spent his life trying to prove that he belonged in their world. Now, he was finally ready to prove that they had never deserved him in the first place. He took a deep breath. And then, Henry Ellis began to speak. The fire had arrived. And this time, he would not put it out.